Good morning and welcome to another edition of COVID Calls. Today we're going to be discussing journalism and politicians, how journalists and politicians have been affected by COVID, any long-lasting changes, any current changes that we need to be discussing. We'll also talk about the Standards Commissioner's report, which I guess is also part of this discussion in terms of journalism, social media, politicians, etc. So we have a wide range of panelists. We're going to be starting with Jean-Claude Micallef and Therese Comodini Cachia, and later on the program we also have Tim Diacono, editor of Lovin Malta, and Nigel Mifsud, the secretary of IGM. Therese will be joining the stream in a second because she's had some technical difficulties, but what we're going to do is we'll start straight away with Jean-Claude Micallef is one of Labour's newest MPs, elected in December, appointed to Parliament in January, just when this whole COVID thing began. And as we said before, we also have Therese Comodini Cachia, Nationalist MP, who is joining us as well. So, Jean-Claude and Therese, I'd like to ask you, first of all, how Parliament has changed. I know, Jean, you started right with the pandemic, so perhaps you didn't see much change. But what's it been like for you as an MP in COVID time?
No, I kicked it off with a political crisis, and then I moved on to a health crisis. So definitely it's a baptism of fire for me. But as we all know, when the tough gets going,
when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. Therese, what about you? How you've been there for a while? What's it been like now in COVID times? Are you taking a lot of precautions? Is there social distancing?
Okay, so Parliament hasn't really changed, and to be very honest, Parliament shouldn't change. On the contrary, in a crisis, Parliament should remain working and functioning. The only difference is that, of course, we do try to keep social distancing, so we do try to sit on different seats, and we do try to leave seats in between us, empty seats, and our temperatures are taken when we enter the building. Besides that, I mean, there are masks that are available for anyone who would like to use them. But other than that, parliamentary work needs to continue, I would say, even more in a crisis, because in a crisis like this, we really should be working together to address it.
John, what about these Zoom press conferences that we're seeing? I know that you've organized a few yourself as well, and you obviously have experience in the media yourself. You're a broadcaster as well. So how have you seen that change happening?
Well, that helps, of course, being a broadcaster, and it made my life easier in this situation. But I need to consider other MPs who aren't that media savvy. And obviously, as Therese said, this is the time where we all need to work together. And it is the time where the people, the public, expects that their MPs are there in such times. Well, even though I'm a broadcaster, I don't like the way that we are opting for these Zoom and webinars. It lacks the human touch, obviously, and it lacks expressions and all that we're used to. Obviously, it's something different. On the other hand, it's more practical. It's easier for us to communicate and use a different platform, which is not only in my opinion, more accessible, but it looks amateurish in a way. On the other hand, it has formed a barrier for some, so it has its pros and cons. Well, in general, I look forward to the day that press conferences are held back to normal, where journalists don't have only limited questions and one can butt in as you please. So obviously, yes, there are some challenges that we had to go about. On the other hand, for all those politicians who are usually a bit camera shy or media shy, I think this is a good time for them.
Therese, you mentioned that Parliament should remain operating as normal. Do you think journalists should also be operating as normal? We saw that photo, for example, of the Prime Minister giving a press comment outside the courts the day that public groupings were limited, and there was a pack of 20 journalists over there, probably. Do you think that was as in the journalists be continuing as normal as well, or do you think that these precautions should be taken?
Okay, so when I refer to normal, I mean that our profession as politicians should remain normal. Our professional lives should really go on. If this is our work, we need to continue doing it. And the work of politicians, or even more the work of journalists, is even more important at a time of a crisis than in normal, ordinary times, because this is when particular questions need to be raised. And because this is a health crisis, a pandemic, then it is the journalists who are the frontliners to bring that information into our houses that people need to know and people want to know. So normal in the sense of, should you continue exercising your profession normally? Of course. We need it even more. Today, we need journalists even more than we needed before the pandemic. But normal does not mean put journalists at risk. Normal does not mean put anyone at risk. No, it is wrong to call journalists together and congregate at a small space, touching each other, disregarding social distancing. That is wrong. But I tend to disagree a bit with Claude on using media and apps and online apps for journalists, in the sense of, it is true, it lacks that, human touch. And very often when we speak to each other, we're taking messages not just by listening to what someone is telling us, but also their behavior, how they are reacting to it, their facial expressions, their body language. And that must have made a big difference for journalists, as it will make a big difference for most professionals. But the fact that we have managed to shift our journalists online, and a lot of work has gone online into press conferences and similar activities, simply means that our journalists have really taken the call, and they've really, put in an effort into continuing their profession online. What I really would not like to see is abuse of these software apps, because of course it is easy for me now to abuse my position because we're on an application and say, I don't want to answer your question. I'm not facing you. There are methods of how to ignore questions raised by journalists when you're using social media apps. And this is where it becomes even more important for persons in public life to be even more open and transparent with journalists.
Okay, Jean, I'm sure you have something to respond to what Therese just said, but I want to also ask you, in terms of PQs, for example, at the moment in a health pandemic, are ministers also, do you think any ministers are also taking advantage of this pandemic in terms of not answering certain PQs, or using the health pandemic as an excuse to not do their parliamentary work in any way?
Well, I hope not, even though I have a couple of PQs which I'm still waiting an answer for. On the other hand, with regards to the way a broadcaster, the way a journalist needs to put up questions, yes, I agree with Therese that this platform, as I said, is another opportunity for one to reach out more, not only the public, but even the protagonists behind any particular story. What I'm a bit concerned about is the fact that when we speak about journalists, we're not speaking only about journalists like Christian Peregin or Tim Diacono or Nigel Mifsud, but we need to include also all those photographers, all those videographers as well, who are a crucial part for all the top stories and features that have made the news. Unfortunately, with such platforms as we are experiencing right now, the picture is what it is. This is the maximum of the expressions we can get. And as Therese highlighted, for example, when there was that particular moment where you had the Prime Minister surrounded by all these reporters, disrespecting the social distancing criteria, and ironically, these are the same people who everyone has been watching on a daily basis, asking Professor Charmaine Gauci tons of questions, but we need to focus more on the answers. And unfortunately, seeing the journalists not respecting or not even listening to those guidelines is obviously an irony, which, as Therese highlighted, it shouldn't be neither. So yes, an effort has to be done by all, not just politicians, not just normal citizens, but first and foremost journalists as well.
So we'll be talking a bit more about journalism with our journalist colleagues, who will be talking about that incident and also other journalism related questions. But I want to now pick on something topical, the Standards Commissioner report on the Standards Commissioner's report on social media misuse of public resources by ministers. John, yesterday you commented on this case, and you said that you welcomed the report because it establishes clear guidelines that didn't exist before, and you also think that resources should be given to MPs to help them promote their parliamentary work as well. But in terms of what ministers have done, so we've had years of ministers having only their private pages instead of ministry pages. Now we're seeing that changing. Do you think that constitutes misuse of public resources? Are you concerned as a backbencher? I mean that even we heard, for example, that by doing so, these ministers were improving their position when it comes to other MPs who don't have those resources. So how do you see this issue? Are you annoyed about the fact that ministers were using public money to promote their profiles?
So first and foremost, I welcome the report as part of the Labour parliamentary group. We have not only welcomed the report, but we have also, as the Commissioner for Standards highlighted, we have been in discussions thanks to our whip and even Ministers Amit Lewis. And I've read the report, and obviously, like others have done, but not everyone has the same agenda, and therefore one could give a different perspective to it. Well, personally, I welcome such reports because of the fact that, as I stated, I think it was my second day in Parliament when I was speaking on the budget estimates, the Parliament budget estimates, and I suggested that Parliament should focus in giving more resources, and unfortunately, we have always stopped when we speak about resources. We have always stopped on the financial part. I focused mainly on seeing MPs having human resources, primary parliamentary assistant, and a PR responsible especially for constituency works to join the works being carried forward in Parliament, and also all the efforts in relation to the constituency that we represent. And I think that what the Commissioner has stated clearly is that what one is doing, what any cabinet member is doing, it's good to be of public knowledge, but one needs to make a clear and this is hard to do. We need to underline the fact that, yes, it is not easy to distinguish. So we're speaking about the same person who is a minister, for example, and who is the same person that everyone knows, and like every politician, he's there to take credit. But yes, one cannot use public funds for personal credit, and one cannot ignore the fact that there is a public office with certain regulations, and as I commented yesterday, these should be the same outlined by the permanent principal secretary, and therefore, while welcoming the report of the commissioner, one needs to stick to what the PPS has outlined, and let's avoid a double jeopardy situation. So
okay, I'd like to get Therese's view as well. Therese, I'd like to ask you about Jean's proposal. Actually, I think it's quite interesting that MPs should be given resources to help them promote their work and their constituency. I imagine this is something that the opposition would benefit from as well, since the opposition doesn't really get much resources at all. Do you agree with that proposal?
Chris, first, I'd like to make a comment on the social distancing issue and journalists. I don't think that was an incident where it was the journalists who were ignoring the social distancing. I don't think the fault should be placed on the journalists, okay? Let's be very clear. I don't think that social distancing rules should be used as an excuse to avoid questioning or to start blaming journalists. This is a trend of blaming journalists that needs to stop in this country. And I'm sure that Jean-Claude would agree with me on this.
And we'll discuss it in the rest of the program anyway as well.
But the question of whether MPs should have assistance is not a proposal made by Jean-Claude first. This has been a proposal made by the opposition for years now, ever since I've been in politics, which has been only the last 7 or 8 years. I have had this proposal on the table. My party has had this proposal on the table. It has been in our published policy documents, and both leaders, both Simon Busuttil as well as Adrian Delia, have consistently asked for assistance to MPs and assistance to whoever is representing people in Parliament.
So quite positive to have a government MP agreeing with that.
It is, in fact, very positive to have a government MP to agree. However, let us be very clear that there is a very big difference between government MPs and opposition MPs. Government MPs, and we have seen this in the last 2 legislatures of a Labour government, most of the backbenchers, if not all, today not all, but till just a few months ago most, enjoyed either contracts with government entities, or else other appointments on government bodies, and therefore they had a lesser weight to shoulder to be able to continue either their profession or to substantiate their income to be able to continue supporting their family. Opposition MPs are put in a situation whereby they need to fulfill, and they should fulfill. This is our obligation, it is our responsibility, and we do it gladly. We need to continue to fulfill our service as politicians and as government and as opposition MPs. But we also need to make sure that we need to continue to fulfill other roles as well that we have in our lives. This is also the question of, should we have full-time MPs? But the financial aspect is only part of it, because even without the financial aspect, if we were given assistance like research assistance on compiling information, assistance on preparing for a speech, assistance on identifying what other countries have in their legislation when you are discussing legislation. This is all work.
More effective,
This is all work that I undertake on my own. If I am discussing a bill in Parliament, I undertake this research, and I tend to take it a bit seriously because Maybe it is my academic background that provides me with that, but I am sure that all my colleagues do that as well. And yes, help in that manner would really, really give another push to the standard of our work.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'll come back to you, Jean, in a second. But I just on the Standards Commissioner's report, Terry, are you in agreement that ministers should give back the money, or that there should be some Auditor General report? What's your position on that? Very quickly, so we can conclude with Jean.
The Commissioner's report is a positive way forward. However, let me be very clear. No one needed a Commissioner's report to realize that using public funds for your personal Facebook page is a no-go way. It is a no thing to do. No one needed that report to realize that. And needing to move forward, however, the outcome of the report is important because it provides us with very clear guidelines. Can you use public funds for your personal Facebook page? No. This is now clear. If there ever was a doubt, now this is clear. Should they pay the money back? Well, yes. They have, after all, made use of public funds, which they shouldn't have made use of.
Okay, thank you very much. Jean, I know you wanted to respond to something.
More than a thing, or even though there are plenty of common grounds, but I have to differ with Therese when she said that the opposition has been highlighting on the same lines of my proposals. I remember the same day that I suggested a way forward in Parliament and having such resources. I had the deputy leader of the Nationalist Party doing a 40-minute speech about the opposition leader having a second driver. And it was, for me, it was literally left me speechless, seeing the second in command in the opposition doing such an effort to try and convince Parliament that the best way forward for Parliament to be effective is to have a second driver assigned to the leader of the opposition. So therefore, one needs to focus more on what I suggested and what Therese has highlighted.
What about the point of ministers' misuse of social media?
Yes, on the other hand, let's just take this clear. The Commissioner's report has stated that this is a closed case, and but obviously there are others who are pushing their agenda forward through different perspectives of the report, as if this was a report that has condemned certain individuals. It didn't. It is a positive report that is highlighting certain guidelines so that we avoid certain scenarios that we are used to in the past. And now we're speaking about social media, but let us not fool ourselves. We had ministers in previous administrations using billboards, using leaflets, all from public funds. So what are we saying? That we should dig into the past and make sure that one needs to start paying back these funds. I think the way forward is that each and every cabinet member will stick, as has done our deputy prime minister and even the economic minister, who have created a page on the same guidelines highlighted by the commissioner, and that is the way forward. But
thank you very much. We're going to have to move on again.
Yesterday, for example, there was a story assuming that Minister Rodriguez was using public funds when it wasn't the case. So we can't just assume that any feature, any footage was paid by public funds. Not the case.
Obviously, as well, we can't know unless that information is made transparent. But We've got to move on to our other guests. Thank you very much, Jean-Claude Micallef and Therese Comodini Cachia, for being with us and for sharing your experiences, and good luck in this COVID time. I'm just going to now bring on our next two guests, fellow journalists. We have Nigel Mifsud, the Secretary General of the IGM, and we have Tim Diacono from Lovin Malta itself, the editor of Lovin Malta. Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Nigel is still on mute. Okay, this is part of the software problem.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. So you had the MPs talking about journalism and the changes that are happening. I want some of your reflections. Let's start with you, Nigel. What do you make of that Robert Abela photo of journalists, packing outside court? Is this just a reality? Journalists are frontliners; they've got to do their jobs, or do you think there is a responsibility here, either from the side of politicians or journalists?
Well, our lives have truly changed. Our job has truly changed during the past few weeks. I refer to that particular incident. I was there amongst those journalists. We are truly frontliners. We have been locked for the past few weeks inside our newsrooms, our own homes, to follow news conferences online through Zoom or through Skype or through other methods. And it was, I think, the first time after quite a couple of days or weeks whereby we had to go out at Republic Street in Valletta to get the Prime Minister's comments. And while we were respecting social distance just before the Prime Minister came out, I think at that particular time, duty called, and we all just rushed, as we normally do, forgetting that we're in this whole pandemic situation. And we went to get the Prime Minister's comments on various topics. I think it was a very naive way of doing it. And I think it was ironic to see such a group of people gathered around each other, the same people who on a daily basis relay and provide information to the public on the importance to keep social distance. And
it must be said that the IGM did issue guidelines on how to go to conferences with sticks and other things, but obviously in the heat of the moment.
To be quite honest, I was using an extension, mic extension, to get the Prime Minister's comment, but having almost 20 journalists surrounding the Prime Minister was quite difficult to keep the social distancing rules and getting the comment. So I think it was quite naive from our end, and it wasn't right, and it wasn't the right situation to do.
Okay. Tim, I want to ask you about the Zoom press conferences. So I'm a bit torn over here. On the one hand, we have the chance to from the comfort of our homes attend lots of different press conferences in the day. On the other hand, we can be shut off, after asking one question, which sometimes we are in real life as well. How are you seeing it? Do you want this to continue? Do you think that an element of it can continue?
So yes, like you said, there are two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, it's way more practical, right? So the fact that you can just access a press conference from your own home without having to drive to the place, not having to find parking, it makes it way more convenient. And the end result of that is that more journalists from many newsrooms are attending press conferences than they used to, or than they otherwise would have. So I suspect that the chances are that if, for example, the daily press briefings of Sean Mingauchi were not held via Zoom, not every newsroom would attend every press conference every day. Therefore, more questions get to be asked to her on behalf of the public. However, on the other hand, there is also the reality that once you ask your question, then that's it. Then you're shut off, and sometimes not even then. So there were also cases where we were shut off from Zoom before we even got a chance to finish the question because they didn't like the question. So the authorities do maintain that power. All you need to do is just press a button and that's it. The journalist question isn't even asked. But even when it is asked, it's very, very easy for whoever is answering the question not to answer it. So, for example, you can ask two questions. the person at the receiving end will give a non-answer, and then you move on. Like, there's no, if there was a real live press conference, it would be obvious that the journalist would just, say, "Oh, you didn't answer my question." So what's the answer? Now, in terms of Zoom, you can't, because as soon as you've asked the question, your mic is switched off, and it moves on to the next person. I don't think this is something that we should get used to as though it's something normal. Like, I get that it's the realities at the moment are what they are, but there are important questions that are being left unanswered, and it's way too convenient for politicians, especially, not to answer certain questions.
Do you think that the future will include Zoom press conferences as like the option to both attend physically and attend by Zoom? Is that desirable at any rate?
That could be the case. I mean, I suppose that when restrictions start getting eased, first of all, there are already media houses who do attend press conferences, right? So, for example, TVM does physically attend the press conferences of Professor Sharma Gauchi. At least the camera person does, and even the other broadcasters do. So there already are some elements of the media who are physically present in the room. What's also possible is to try and enforce social distancing during a press conference. So, for example, if you follow the White House press briefings, the way they've done that, the way they've worked out is they've spaced out all the chairs to ensure the journalists are kept 2 meters away from each other. Now the journalists are all wearing masks as well. So there is a way to have the physical press conference.
What's your preference?
I tend to agree with Jean-Claude in that that sometimes nothing can replace the physical connection there. So being physically present, like, while obviously Zoom is way more convenient, and I don't think it should be eliminated entirely, not having the opportunity at all to be physically present does harm the process significantly, both in terms of asking and questions and getting answers, but also in terms of following up, in terms of, like you said, noting human expressions, and even speaking to the people there as well.
Nigel, you were nodding your head earlier about TVM journalists. You're a TVM journalist. Are they not attending events?
Firstly, I'm speaking here as Secretary General of the Institute of Maltese Journalists, but no, we do not attend as journalists for such press conferences. We follow the Zoom press conferences from PBS Creativity Hub. I tend to agree with what Tim has said. The reality is that Zoom is convenient, but not as practical. So I can't wait for the day that traditional press conferences are organized once again, whereby we can go at the ministries or other places to ask questions, and most importantly, follow-up questions, which are limited at the moment. We're limited to ask just one question from each newsroom, and that's it. However, sometimes, as we know, not all questions are answered, and that's our duty to keep on bugging the person addressing the press conference to get the answers that we rightly deserve.
But just a point of clarification. Currently, is it the journalists and the newsroom's choice not to attend a press conference physically, or are they being ordered by the government not to attend and to attend via Zoom instead? So if you wanted to, Nigel,
you cannot.
Sorry?
You just cannot attend for the press conference in person. You have to follow it through Zoom.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, that is a concern, right? You mentioned as well, we mentioned earlier the financial pressures of newsrooms, in that newsrooms very often don't send journalists to every press conference because they're understaffed in that sense. What do you make of this? I know the IGM has issued a statement about the need of more financial support.
Yes. In fact, during the past few weeks, we issued a number of statements whereby we called on the authorities to organize an independent and free fund for media outlets. I talked to most of the news editors, and they all have the same opinion that media outlets are lacking resources. We know that the pool of journalists whereby we can choose new journalists to recruit is getting narrower, and we do need more funding to have a decent salary for all journalists. And also we need certain funding for training purposes, for example, as journalists need more training on their particular subjects.
Mm-hmm. We're having a little bit of technical issues over here with Chris's laptop.
I see. But I might wanted to add, Tim, the fact that there are certain circumstances whereby ministers are organizing press conferences also on Facebook Live, and that's even worse because we can't even ask questions directly. That's quite worrying. And while we have certain technological feats which helped us go through this pandemic quite smoothly, we do call on such ministries to organize Zoom press conference, so at least we have the opportunity to at least ask just one question.
Yes, and as somebody has pointed out in our comment section, in the UK, the way it works is that press conferences are held via Zoom, but journalists are also given the opportunity to ask a follow-up question as well, which is something that absolutely does not happen over here, and it is something that we definitely should at least think about introducing. I'd like to just add a point about what you mentioned regarding the fund. Obviously, there are financial pressures, as there are.
I'm back. I don't know how that happened.
Once again.
We know the dangers of Zoom, right? We're talking about the financial pressures before, but there are also other elements as well in terms of journalist harassment, right? Nigel, you've issued a number of statements in the past few days and weeks about the harassment being faced by journalists on a daily basis, even by politicians. Do you think that's being worsened by the COVID situation and this sense of distance?
Well, the problem is not COVID. The problem is a lack of media literacy in most circumstances. Every time we issue a press release, for example, claiming that there is harassment and intimidation and threats on journalists present throughout all newsrooms, even probably on this live broadcast, we see a barrage of comments of intimidation towards journalists. Journalists are being mocked. Journalists are being bullied. Why? Because they are simply asking questions that might be uncomfortable for certain politicians, for example. And we just cannot keep silent on that matter. We have to call on the authorities to firstly condemn such comments, and we have to change the situation. Journalists must be respected. The journalists are actually frontliners. Most of the people back in March went out in the balconies to applaud all frontliners. I hope that they were putting in mind journalists as well, who have to go out on a daily basis, who have to ask some uncomfortable questions to get the message across. I mean, for example, in relation to the report issued by the press, the public, Dr. Hisler, whereby which I have to applaud yourself, Chris, for putting forward such claims. It's part of our job. It came to light because the press did its job. And that's why it's the fourth pillar of democracy. We cannot have a democracy without having the press scrutinizing the authority.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of that, Tim?
Yes, so look, the reality is that as soon as you put yourself in the public eye, you're going to open yourself up to public criticism. Whether you're a journalist, whether you're a politician, whether you're an activist, no matter who you are, it's the reality of it. And the fact that there's, the reality of social media means that anyone can just pass a comment. So I think the first thing that we need to start off with is that this is a reality, and sometimes the best defense is to build a thick skin and just ignore certain comments like they mean absolutely nothing sometimes. And there's also, unfortunately, a reality that sometimes the more you show that these comments are getting to you, the more these comments are going to come as well. So there is that element of having to build a thick skin when you're in the public eye. However, when the comments are coming from politicians, it's a different matter, because sometimes I get the impression that politicians, especially people in government, ministers, don't realize how powerful they are, or they pretend not to realize how powerful they are. So that when a comment coming from a citizen is not the same as a comment coming from a minister. As a minister, you wield a lot of power, and it's not as though you're just having a debate with somebody, with a different political opinion outside or as a friend or whatever. But when you're actually a minister saying this, your words carry a lot of weight, and it's not a level playing field. And I think they should realize how much power they have and exercise it properly.
It's really
not only in terms of journalists and in terms of private citizens as well, because we've seen this happen as well.
It's interesting that you're making this connection. Like, there's another connection to be made here in relation to the Standards Commissioner's report and people and ministers' use of social media. Remember that the report that Lovin Malta filed was triggered in part by an investigation that we had done. I believe it was you, Tim. So give us some more information about it, but about how government was buying so much social media boost, so much Facebook boost, that they were effectively buying enough reach to totally dilute the media's sort of voice, right? So I think the study showed that just on Facebook boosts alone, and that's not considering organic reach, that's not considering cost of production, the government was able to buy the equivalent of 11 Lovin Malta's worth of reach, right? So we had done that analysis, right?
Yes, essentially. And there's also an interesting comparison that we had made with Canada, who was actually criticized in the world press for spending an exorbitant amount of money on these social media ads, and it turns out Malta was spending so much more. So there are exactly. There are a lot of elements to this. There is that issue that once Facebook has become, or at least one of the main feeds for acquiring information, when public funds are spent, they have to be spent very wisely and with that level of foresight as well. So when you're funneling public funds into a minister's private profile, you're basically making sure that as many people see this guy or this person as possible. So there's that element, yes, that propaganda can reach people's ears at a much faster rate and more people than the media can, all combined. And there's also the issue of misuse as well. So first of all, it's not our study that we had conducted was specifically on terms of boosts. So this is when you pay money to Facebook so that it will push your post and make it reach more people. The Standards Commissioner went a step further. He also spoke in terms of public resources. So not just how much money you spent on boosting, but also on the use of public resources. So for example, a videographer, right? So he noticed that there are some videos that ministers uploaded to their personal pages that never appeared anywhere else. So there was a video about the economy, for example, that only appeared on the Facebook profile of the Minister for the Economy, not on the government's Facebook page, not on TV, not on the government's website. So he drew the conclusion that this video was made for the minister's personal page. And that would obviously, like, a video doesn't come cheap. Like, there's the use, so you have to pay somebody to make it, to edit it, to film it. Sometimes drones were used as well, so there's this use of resources as well.
If I can just add a point to this, I mean, Jean-Claude said earlier, and I think he's very right in saying that we shouldn't presume that people are using public funds for those, that ministers are using public funds for those productions. However, we actually had ministers who didn't even respond to the Standards Commissioner, and I think this is one thing that we forget in terms of its importance. Like, we're talking about ministers not responding to journalists sometimes in press conferences. Here, in some cases, they weren't even responding to the Standards Commissioner, who was appointed by Parliament itself to investigate these issues. So so there's
we have a problem. We have a problem in terms of politicians like blurring the lines between their official functions and the political functions. So so sometimes there would be a video with the logo of the ministry and the logo of the minister's personal campaign as well. So yes, I mean, like as soon as the logo of the ministry is there, the implication is very clear that this is an initiative by the ministry. The ministry makes use of public funds, therefore, like the fact that it implies that public funds were used, and the fact that they didn't respond to him, as you said, makes it seem pretty clear that they were used, at least in some cases.
So we're running out of time. I want to get like a last conclusion from Nigel, but I also want to refer to one of the points that one of the comments that someone shared with us, which I think is a really important point, which is that in the UK, journalists are given the opportunity to ask a question, and then once this is answered, they're told again, is there anything I need to come back to you on? A bit how when we call a customer service agent we're told, can I help you with anything else? And I think that's really, the best practice, and it's really important to have that. And the same person also commented about these live unannounced press conferences where journalists don't even have the chance to be there on time to ask questions. Nigel, a quick reflection from you about those points, and we'll conclude the program because we're running out of time.
No, I think that's an ideal situation, and we should put forward. I mean, I commit myself to send, as IGM, to send these proposals to the health authorities to consider such options. It's quite ideal to have the opportunity to ask follow-up questions. I would like to take the opportunity to thank all journalists, all frontliners in this pandemic. We must appreciate that they're going through certain pressures to produce news at this current time. Should it be 100 years ago, I think we wouldn't be able to do such work. And I think we must respect the fact that technological aspects have helped us make it through. But once again, I cannot wait for the day that we get a press call to go to the ministry to do the press conferences there, and as a broadcast journalist, have the opportunity to ask questions on camera to the particular person, minister, politician, etc., on any subject which we would like to ask him on or her.
And maybe our laptops won't stop to update themselves mid press conference or mid show. Thank you very, very much. We had Therese Comodini Cachia and Jean-Claude Micallef earlier. Thank you very much, Nigel Mifsud, and well done for your work as IGM. And thank you, Tim, colleague, for joining the program as well and sharing some of your insights. We'll be with you again tomorrow on COVID calls. I'm just going to do a quick conclusion over here. I think it was really interesting today to hear from the journalists and the politicians about some of the realities that are being faced. There's this big discussion about press conferences and whether we should be allowed to attend, whether we should be whether Zoom is enough, whether Zoom should continue even beyond the COVID pandemic, and whether there are better practices to be used. I think the best takeaway came from a comment we had, which is comparing the situation in the UK to the situation in Malta in terms of how questions are received and taken. And it was interesting to see Nigel committing himself to make this proposal to the health authorities. So maybe this program results in some change over there. The reality is that journalists can have a big impact on society and on changes. We've seen that even with the Standards Commissioner's report on the on the misuse of social media by ministers, and we're already seeing the changes taking place. So we saw Chris Fenn started his own. Started a Facebook page for the health system. We had Sylvia Schembri start one for the economy ministry. And I think what's important to keep in mind as taxpayers as well for why these things make sense is because when these people stop being ministers and someone else takes their place, at least there will be a foundation on which to continue the messaging of the ministries. And I think that makes more efficient use of taxpayers' money. That's all we've got for you for today. I've been Chris Peregin, and this has been COVID Calls, and we'll be with you tomorrow discussing another interesting topic.